Two, three. Hi, everybody. I have a very, very special guest today. And before I introduce him, I just wanted to give you guys some background. One of the most fascinating times in my life was when I started college after moving to America in 2002. And we were required in our curriculum to take a few humanities courses. And I had a friend, Chris, in college, and he helped me pick this class. It's not a class that I was going to pick originally because I couldn't tell what the class would be about. And he picked the class thinking, you know what, I think this is a class where we're going to go in, sit down, listen, and leave. So the day came, the first class. We entered the classroom, we sat down, and a few minutes later, our professor walked in. And it was a dark room, the lights weren't on, and he said, "Let there be a light." And then a few hours later, when we walked out of the classroom, Chris realized that this class was not for him. And for me, that was the day I met my mentor, the great Professor Christie. The class, the way the class was structured, at least this is what I took away from the class. It was basically to show how religion and science are interconnected. The name of the class was Science and Religion. However, that is not what I took away from this class. To me, this was the first taste of freedom for a kid that grew up in a society without freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom to debate, and freedom to offend. Questions like who triggered the Big Bang? What is consciousness? Should lines in religious books be taken literally? Professor Christie inspired me to be a thinker. In the world of followers, he taught me to be a leader. He opened my eyes to paradigms that I couldn't see earlier. Most people in my place do not always get to run into coaches, life coaches like Professor Christie, a mentor, man of few words, sometimes strong words, sometimes angry words, and sometimes full of compassion, empathy, and love. His simple advice that cream always rises to the top, to this day serves me in more ways that I could ever count. Professor Christie, how was that for an intro?
I think we should end the session right there.
Fair enough, fair enough. So, Professor Christie, I just want to, dive in right away because there's so much that I would love to talk about and there's so much happening in the world. But before we dive into, the today, I would love for people to know your background, what you're about, and what you have done overall in your life. If you can sum that up quickly.
Yes, I'll try to be succinct, but being of the Irish-Scottish background, it's hard for me to really be succinct. But in any event, I had 3 careers in my life. I started out after college in public administration, which was a wonderful experience in municipal government and the politics involved. That lasted about 6 years, and then I left that, and I went into theater, and I became a theater producer for about 16 years. I produced over 100 shows and had the great honor and pleasure to interview thousands upon thousands of performing artists and hired many of them. I left that after 16 years to pursue my original passion, which was theology. I went back to Fordham University to complete a long postponed doctorate in systematic theology, which is another name for philosophical theology, which we'll get into as we go along. And I completed it under a major American theologian called Avery Cardinal Dulles. He was, before he passed away, considered to be the number 1 American Catholic theologian. And when he was elevated to the cardinalate back in, what was that, 2004 or 5, I think. He invited me to Rome to be one of his special guests. That was just such an honor. And under his tutelage, I did my doctorate on the conversion experiences of now St. John Henry Newman. And I've made Newman a lifelong study, and I've been pursuing that ever since. I've presented numerous papers on Newman. I've written articles on him, and I just published a major book called The Logic of Conversion, the study of his conversion experiences from the time he was born until the age of 45, when he left the Anglican Church to become a Roman Catholic, much to the anger and chagrin of much of the British population, especially his theological colleagues. At the same time, I responded to an ad at DeVry University. At the time, it was the DeVry Institute of Technology, way back in those days, for someone to teach philosophy. So I replied to that, and lo and behold, I got the job. So I started teaching philosophy. Since DeVry was a private secular institution, they wouldn't teach theology, but philosophy is the handmaiden of theology. In fact, you can't do good religious thinking unless you first are a good philosophical thinker. So that was right up my alley. So I started in that, that was back in 1993. I began teaching at DeVry. And one thing led to another. I was able to design special courses. I was able to fit in courses like Science and Religion, which Bilal just mentioned, the Ethics of World Religions. So I always tried to have a thrust that would intertwine several areas of thinking, which is what the humanities should do. As my great intellectual mentor, John Henry Newman, always said, that the sciences and the humanities are so intertwined that one without the other really damages one's educational outlook. So I always tried to keep that in mind. So I taught at DeVry until, was that 2014? I retired from DeVry. And I took a position for a year in Pittsburgh as the executive director of the National Institute of Newman Studies, perfectly made for me. And then I left that in 2016, and I have been most happily retired since then, doing research and writing and enjoying my family, and especially my young grandson. And that brings me up to today. So, does that answer your question?
Absolutely. So you talked about the religious part of things, right? So you've spent a lot of time reading about religions. But you also had a class called Science and Religion. Now, I understand the purpose of the class was that science and religion are related. One answers the question, the other asks, almost, in some situations. And I saw a bit of that in the class. But as someone that knows so much about the background of religions, what are your thoughts on some of the disagreements, like evolution? How do you view that? Or do you feel that it's just something that's not necessarily mentioned in the religious books, but that's just what they mean to say happened?
I don't think there is any conflict on the issue of evolution. Certainly not from my perspective, nor from the perspective of my Roman Catholic denomination. John Paul II wrote on that, and he said, he affirmed that evolution is simply one of the ways that God designed creation to work. And if you really think about that, that certainly cannot be proven otherwise. In any kind of philosophical analysis of that position, why couldn't the laws of nature have been designed to eventually bring about what we call human nature? Well, it's a fact that it did. We know that to be just self-evident. The question then is, well, why couldn't that be, since it is in fact a fact, if you want to look at it that way, why couldn't that be the design of creation? At least in my opinion, it certainly seems to be.
Right. I mean, it's possible, but the religious text, at least literally, does not necessarily mention that. For example, things like Adam and Eve were the first human beings on Earth. Now, I understand that could be interpreted differently, so I guess it goes back to our class, the literal meaning versus allegorical meaning of things.
Very good point, yes. We have to keep in mind always, and this is where what we would call epistemology comes in philosophy. That means epistemology is the study of what we know and how we know it. One of the two major building blocks of all human intellectual activity. And epistemology, in the case of biblical literature, means we have to have a very strong appreciation for the historical nature of those documents. When it comes to Genesis, and in fact the entire Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, we have to keep in mind that they were written at least 3,200 years ago. And we have trouble understanding things from 100 years ago in terms of their time and place. 3,200 years ago, it was a very different time, a very different outlook that humanity had, and it was colored by a number of other factors that we have to appreciate in order to actually interpret it. And you mentioned one of them, the allegorical. And that's something that does take time and study. It takes a lot of research and examining the studies of many, many people that came before us in order to be able to have any kind of accurate interpretation of that literature. It is, after all, literature, and we know that literature is colored by its time and its place.
Right.
So one cannot just pick up the book of Genesis and interpret it through the eyes of today. That would be terribly wrong. That would be a very inaccurate interpretation of the Old Testament.
See, one of the questions that always come to my mind, and before I take this more towards science, I want to ask this question. And this is more in general about religions, not necessarily just Christianity. For a book that is meant for a common person, why does it have to be interpreted And why is it not written in very, very simple language? Why would that be?
That's a good question, that's multidimensional, because some of it is very factual. We know that from historical studies. Some of it is very poetic, because let me back up a little bit and say that the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, its analysis has led scholars to conclude that there were at least 4 major strands of authorship of the Old Testament. But they're all intertwined. So when you pick it up, you have to be able to discriminate between authors and styles to really appreciate what is being said. For example, an historical account of a battle is much different than a poetic spiritual lamentation. Very, very different styles and authors. A major problem which we have, which you're raising, is a lack of appreciation for the complexity of the literature. And why is that so? Well, I think we can simply say that the Bible is the recording of the ongoing history of a people as it tried to come to grips with its best understanding of where we came from and where we're going. So it's a very deep piece of literature that cannot be read like some kind of a romance novel.
Or a manual.
Or a manual. Yeah, okay.
But that is where I like to push back a little bit more and say...
Push.
That it is a manual. It is supposed to be a manual for life, right? So, in my observation, I do not find most human beings, and as offensive it may sound to a lot of people, I do not find most human beings to be deep thinkers. I do not find them to be observant enough to connect one example written in a book to multiple experiences. They would probably just think about the most recent experience and say, oh, but that's not how life works. Doesn't that make the job of helping people more difficult? Could this book have been written possibly in a simpler way? Maybe it could have been a much thicker book, possibly. But you see what I'm saying? That it's not, for most people that aren't deep thinkers, they get lost.
Good question. And this is where, and I'm glad you led right into it, this is why we have, in my denomination, in Roman Catholicism, we have the institution of the church. Now, Roman Catholics believe and accept that the church was instituted directly by Jesus Christ for the very purpose that you're asking about right now. The purpose of the church, certainly one of its major purposes, is to provide the very kind of guidance that you're asking about. The church's, one of the church's major functions is called the magisterium. Now that's a very Latinistic word, which simply means the teaching office of the church. We have to keep in mind, which is very unfashionable in today's hyper-subjective and individualistic culture, the magisterium has existed for 2,000 years with men and women dedicating their entire lives to exactly what you're talking about, to the study of revelation, which is what we should get back to, because that is exactly what the Bible is, but we didn't talk about that yet. But the magisterium has developed a body of teaching grounded in the scriptures, the Bible, over 2,000 years. And it updates that teaching. For example, the very last one was published not long ago, and it's called the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And what that is, it is a document meant to give the most accurate interpretation of Scripture in light of 2,000 years of the development of thought. It's certainly much easier to read and understand because it's in current contemporary language compared to the Bible. See, now, to me, a serious person really needs to take that into account. That's far, far different than anyone who says, well, I should be able to just grab up the Bible, open a page, and tell you what it says, and that's it. Well, that's a violation of epistemology, you see.
Right.
It's a violation of what we know and how to know it. So that renders such an approach, to me, intellectually void.
100% agree with you, but we know that most people aren't intellectually inclined, right? So, and the part about churches is fascinating because I don't know enough, but I know that most churches do tend to interpret things differently depending on how they view the Bible or whatever text they are following. So there's that piece also. So in the end, basically, you are dependent on the interpreter. Am I reading that correctly? So as someone that goes to the church, you're dependent on how they're going to interpret religion.
Let me refine that a little bit. The church's guidance is meant to do one thing: to help the individual understand how to form that person's conscience about right and wrong. Now, the church does not, and it never has, demanded that you give up your conscience to the church. In fact, the church is very clear that you as an individual, and only you, must decide what you believe is true. The church does not come between you and God. And that's a firm doctrine of the church. It does not preclude your own thinking. And many people, you see, because of their epistemological failures about knowledge, they think they're just commanded to do something, and that's all there is to it. No, that's false. That's not true. The church exists to help you, the individual, try to determine accurately how you should enter into your personal relationship with God. It serves the role more or less like your parent trying to advise you on a relationship you're entering into.
Right.
Your parent doesn't come between you and that person you're going to have the relationship with, but they try to give you the benefit of their wisdom and their experience. And then you're off to the races.
I see. Which makes a lot of sense. How do you view the challenge that the church posted for science when some of the new ideas, and they were considered new, and they were new in the 1700s and 1800s when they came about? The church did not respond in a positive way like it does now. I guess the role of church has also changed over time. But how do you view that? That historically they were not very comfortable with science.
That's absolutely true, and that shows their epistemological failure. Let me see. We know, of course, the famous Galileo case. Mm-hmm. We know that Giovanni Bruno was burned at the stake mm-hmm. in Rome for expressing beliefs which today we would call simply scientifically accurate. And those were horrendous examples of a very important point, which I really need to make. Again, it gets back to the church, which Catholicism considers to be a divinely created institution. It's the only one of its kind that has ever existed. And by that I mean it was created by the God-man Jesus for the very purpose that I just described, to help you form as deep a relationship with God as possible. However, it also has to work through people, because that's what we are. We're human beings. Human beings are very capable, as we know, of error, of doing terrible things. The very strange thing about the church is that it is both divine and human. Now, we can get into that a little bit, but the point about its errors comes from the human side. It's let me try to make another analogy. It's kind of like, your father may have been well-intentioned, but some of his behavior at times may have been negative. Mm-hmm.
Because he's still human.
Yeah. But the church, in its essence, is the locus, the special place where God intervenes in creation. Now that's a big field. I don't know how much you want to explore that. That might be enough for a course right there. But that is the nature of the church as believed by Roman Catholicism for 2,000 years.
So we're essentially saying that there are two aspects to religion. One is the religion itself, which can be a force of good if you understand it and use it wisely in your life. But then there's a matter of human beings delivering the message to you that you're dependent upon. So if there's any human or worldly aspects that can enter the minds of those human beings, for example, if I'm running the church in the 1700s, when all these new discoveries are happening, 1700s, 1600s, I don't know exactly when this started, then what would come to my mind is that, okay, so this guy is saying that the sun does not revolve around us. That's a completely different message from what we are giving our people. And my livelihood is dependent on this because I'm pastor, I'm father of the church. There is a lot of donations that we get to sustain this. And I'm doing this for God. So in my mind, I'm about to justify a very worldly decision using a very religious reason. And I'm going to say, okay, we need to destroy these non-religious thoughts that are about to enter the society, because it can affect the very important work that I am doing. Instead of saying, let me take a step back, keep my personal interest out of it, and see, maybe this can help me understand my own religion even more. But because the message is so non-religious, I'm not open-minded to it. Is that how you would interpret it?
Oh, I have to unpack that a little bit.
Sure.
We have an obligation to always make our best attempt to ascertain what is true. Mm-hmm. That's a fundamental dimension of human consciousness, of which there are 4 in my work on consciousness studies. One of the drives of the mind, one of the 4 major drives, which are all interrelated, is the intellectual drive to determine what is true. If you really think about it, and see, this is where epistemology comes in. We must always examine how we know and what we know it. Every human act involves our attempt to determine what is true, from the very simple act of walking out of the room to whether or not there is a God. From A to Z, the human mind is designed by its very nature to find out the truth. For example, if I got up and bounced off the walls on my way to walk out of the room, you'd probably start to laugh and say, what's going on? But that represents, as simple as it is, my getting out of the room is based on my determining what is the true way to get out of the room. Do you see what I'm saying? There is really only one true way to get out of the room. It's not bouncing off the walls and going in the opposite direction.
Do you mean true way or the most efficient way?
Very good question. Very good question. There can be different ways. There can be different. And that's very insightful. Very insightful. There is more than one way on the path to finding the truth. However, not every path will lead you to truth. All right? That's a very, very important distinction. And again, that's where good philosophical thinking comes in, which in many ways, you're right, you hit on it. Today, many of the problems we're experiencing now in our culture is that many people don't have an appreciation for that philosophical thinking. They're under the false belief that any path is justifiable.
Right.
But that simply is not true.
Why do you think that is? So why do you think people don't have appreciation for philosophical thought on things as compared to people in the past? What has changed?
I don't know if much has changed. I think this has been around throughout human history. It is the extent to which people place a priority on self and their subjective thinking over any regard for what is objectively true. In other words, especially what we are seeing today is whatever I want to consider true is true. That's subjective thinking. Well, follow that out to its logical extent. That would mean And in that thinking, then I'm therefore justified in acting upon it, right? In my thinking, whatever I think is true, and therefore I can act that out. Well, if I happen to think that you are the devil incarnate, and therefore I should jump across the table and kill you, by the laws of your own logic, I'm justified in doing. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you see how subjectivity is not logic? That is rooted in a perversion of perception and intellectual processing, which leads us completely away from truth.
You know, what's funny is I was going to ask you more probing questions about religion, but now that you have touched up on this part, let's move on to how the society is currently changing. Right. This is not something that I thought we would be touching up on today, but let's do it. So, subjectivity, my opinion on things, however limited, versus what is actually true, is what we see in pretty much everywhere these days, right? I don't quite know where that thinking comes from, except I think we have slowly created a culture where we don't like to take personal responsibility for anything. So we're always looking for a reason, an outside reason other than ourselves, to blame, whether the problem is related to us or if it's a societal problem. Because we don't take personal responsibility, we're never going to think about, okay, maybe I'm not philosophical enough. Meaning, maybe I haven't read enough. Maybe I haven't listened enough to people that in the first 5 seconds disagree with me, but there's some substance there. Substance that they have acquired and learned over time. Maybe I have not put in that time into this thinking. Maybe I've read a headline somewhere and I assume that that should be my opinion because it sounded good. Because I realized that, wow, it's not me, it's someone else. And I, in my personal observation, see that happening across the board, all topics, from health, even obesity, to political opinions, to religious opinions, to atheism, all these things that affect our minds on a daily basis, which definitely requires a lot of work other than just reading a headline on a news.com website. I feel people have stopped to put in the work because there's no time and people don't like to take personal responsibility. That's my observation. Now, I don't know what your take on that is.
Your observation is 100% correct. Much of this is a matter of personal choice. I'll make another analogy. When I go home today, I'm going to bask in my recliner watching the NFL games today. Now, take those athletes as an example. They didn't get there by simply their wannabe a professional athlete. They put in a tremendous amount of time, sacrifice, and effort to reach the pinnacle of what you might call physical fitness and ability. The people you just described are like someone who would say, but wait a minute, I just want to get out there and make $1 million like they do. But I don't want to put in the time, the effort, and the sacrifice. Why aren't I entitled to the same benefits that they get? I think you would laugh at them, right? You would say, but you only deserve to receive the benefits of being on that level if you have put in the time and effort and sacrifice to actually be on that level.
Correct.
And intellectually, unfortunately, that is the problem we face today with major groups in society. they are intellectually poorly grounded, and their reasoning is actually irrational. It's not even reasoning. It's simply, to use the philosophical term, solipsistic, which means that you think the only one that exists is yourself. That's solipsistic reasoning, and in philosophy, it's one of the tenets that says, wait a minute, that's irrational, and that opinion has to be ruled out.
And there were multiple examples of that, right? So one of the topics that comes to mind is when the current generations blame the boomers, right? Baby boomers. And they say, hey, look, okay, boomers, you guys messed it up for us. You grew up in the times when things were on the up. So even if you didn't have to go and seek jobs, companies were literally reaching out to you. There was a lot of money to be made. The properties you bought were very, very inexpensive, and they doubled and tripled over time. However, we're not getting the same advantages you did. So thank you. And then over time, the boomers also voted for policies that have now affected the current generation, right? So they blame the boomers. The way I look at that is that's one more example of blaming someone else for the challenges you are given today. The way I look at it, baby boomers didn't plan for this. They didn't want the current generation to suffer. They were living to the best of their ability for the times that they were born in. And they made some decisions. As they grew older, wiser, if they thought some policy should be voted for, they voted for them. Now, and I'm sure some of them didn't vote for them. It was a complete society after all, right? 50% voted for Democrats, 50% voted for Republicans. But now if you're Gen Z or you're a millennial, you have been born into a different time. It's like playing a game of cards. You have your cards. You play with them. There are people still that can be successful, that do find the way. It's just different as compared to what the baby boomers were able to do. They were different times. So why would anyone compare their time to what was going on between the 40s and 60s? I do not understand. But to me, that is one more example of blaming someone else for you not understanding what you need to do today to be successful. What's your take on that?
Well, I agree completely.
Okay.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. And again, as you very rightly analyze, this has to do with a problem in human thinking. People who think like that don't have any firm intellectual grounds on which to stand. You're right, and you yourself know as a contemporary entrepreneur that is out there for them. Mm-hmm. I know in my time, I started a theater company, a business, which was very, very rough, very hard to make any money in the theater business, and yet I made a living at it for almost 20 years. Wow. But it took working 7 days a week. It took an unbelievable amount of stress, but that's what it's called for, and that's what I did, because it enabled me to provide for my family and to do the kind of work that I loved doing. The arts, particularly theater and playwriting, are to me religious experiences, because art is another form of the pursuit of truth. And the pursuit of truth is ultimately the pursuit of God. The ultimate truth is God. And that's the revelation in the book of Genesis of God to Moses at the burning bush. One of the most fundamental truths revealed in the Bible when Moses asked, "Who is it?" God from the burning bush said, "I am." Excuse me. That is the ultimate truth of existence. And that's what we are called to identify, to identify with. Excuse me, just let me wet my whistle here. Don't you see, just let me say a word about revelation, which is critical. Revelation is what Christianity believes is are messages from God sent to mankind. That's actually what revelation is. The Bible is that record. That's why, to get back to our discussion, it needs to be so carefully studied. These are messages from the supernatural level. These were not just thoughts made up by men. God used men to write them, to record them. That's what we believe. There's another doctrine of Christianity called inspiration. Inspiration means that God used men to record supernatural truths that men would not have a way of knowing naturally. And try to put that in more everyday language. It means there are things beyond our knowledge, which we see now epistemologically, talking about knowledge, we have to acknowledge that. Very simple question, which I used to ask in class. How much of everything that there is to know do you know? Right? That's exactly a humbling question. And we have to say, I know very little of what there is to know. Well, that opens the door to the fact then that revelation could very well be true. That there are messages out there which we don't understand yet. See, Christianity says, yes, that's what revelation is.
Well,
Go
okay.
ahead. Go ahead.
Let me ask you possibly the most offensive question. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if you know who Ricky Gervais is. He's actually a comedian.
Yes, he's a very offensive comedian, as I know.
Very offensive comedian.
He likes to humiliate people. That's his technique.
Yes. I'm not a big fan of his comedy. But he was invited to a show with Stephen Colbert. And they were debating, because he is a very well-renowned atheist. And he clarified his position in the interview that he's not exactly atheist. He's more of an agnostic atheist. And he feels that all atheists are really agnostic and not really atheist, because being an atheist would mean that they're confident that there's no God. So they were debating, right? And Stephen Colbert asks him that why is there something instead of nothing? Arguing the point that obviously there is someone that wanted something, that started something. And Ricky Gervais responded, and he said, okay, that's a fair question. But as they continued to debate, Ricky Gervais made a statement which resonated with me, right? There's something in that statement that I think needs to be discussed. He said, if today we could burn every single religious text, whether it's Christianity, Islam, the original Testament, and any other religious books that we have around the world, if we could just burn them, in about 1,000 years, whatever is left of religion is going to be either non-existent or extremely, extremely different from how we understand religion today. But if we were to burn every single book of science, every single equation, it would all come back 100% the same way. How do you respond to that?
I don't think that's true, because, and I don't know if you took my particular course on, I don't know if we covered this in science and religion or not. Maybe in the ethics of world religions we did. Mm-hmm. But
I did not take that class, just so you know. My brother did. So he told me about it.
Okay. A fundamental fact of human history is that since the dawn of modern consciousness, which I suggest is only about 6,000 years ago, that's my analysis, we are very, very recent entries, excuse me, on the scene. And there's scientific evidence to support that. Once we acquired the capacity for abstract thought, mankind has always perceived that there is something beyond us, and we come from a source beyond us, a spiritual life force. And that was man's first attempt to put those thoughts into some kind of order. And that's what we find as the first great phase of human religious activity. And it's called animism, coming from the Latin word animus, which means soul or spirit.
When did you say this? When did you say this was? How many?
We could take it back. Animism probably predates the dawn of the ethical consciousness, which is 6,000 years ago, which is the final piece of human consciousness that we developed into. Mm-hmm. But prior to that, when our ancestors perceived that there was something else going on beyond the physical dimension, mm-hmm. they could tell that there was a difference of life force. Animals, for example, are different from rocks. And even they, in their rudimentary first stages of epistemological development, the development of their knowledge, said, there's something else going on out there. There's something else, and it's not physical. What is this life force that inhabits humans, that inhabits animals? And they began the worship of what we would call that life force in creation. That's called the stage of animism, before they attributed it to a god. That developed over time. Now, as human consciousness is on a roll, once it started, that developed into what we call today religion, which comes from two key words, the prefix re, which means again, and ligio, which means to connect. So religio means to reconnect with the supernatural level that we perceive out there. And that has been man's journey for at least the last 6,000 years. And one developed into another, And we have had many developments first was polytheism in the Greek and Roman tradition, which now anthropomorphized gods, right, everywhere. But then that gave way about roughly a little under 3,000 years ago to the great monotheistic tradition that there is only one supernatural supreme God.
Or the one unknown.
Right. So you go from animism to polytheism to monotheism. And that came in through Judaism, and at the same time, an even slightly older tradition in Hinduism. But there are great parallels there. And anyway, I don't know if that answered your question, but we now live in an age that is heavily, I wouldn't say dominated, because most of the world, in terms of billions of people, are not monotheists, I think. It might be getting close to 50%. But the great monotheistic religions are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Yep. I mean, I have some numbers here for you. So,
Yeah.
If you look at the total number of Christians, and this is, I think, based on analysis done a few years ago, so this is not very recent, but 2.4 billion Christians in the world, so that's by far the most, the leading religion. 1.7 billion Muslims. Islam is the fastest growing religion, so I wonder where that number is going to be in about 20, 30 years, or maybe 100 years. 1.2 billion Hindus. That I did not expect that number to be that large, but it is very large. Then we have 535 million Buddhists and 450 to 500 million atheists. That number surprised me. And about 200 million of those are in China alone, which is interesting, right? Because the way I look at religions is as human beings have evolved and gotten sophisticated. And sophisticated doesn't always mean right. It just means that they now are able to think more clearly about things that they're able to do. So they don't attribute the daily life things that they're now able to achieve to an unknown force in some cases, right? Because if you look at polytheism, that, hey, there's ocean, there must be God of ocean. There's rain, there must be God of rain. So over time, they have consolidated that into one belief that, there must be one God. And some people would argue that the natural next step would be to say, there is no God, it's just nature. That is God. But then if you start to look at nature can differ from one planet to another. So I don't know where that's headed, but that's how I view the evolution of religion. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're on the right path or the wrong path, but we're on a path and it's never a straight line, I feel, to our destination. Sometimes we go backwards, sometimes we go forward. But I think we're at a very interesting time when it comes to understanding and viewing religion and God in our human times, with all the stuff that's happening where people don't like to do deep thinking, but also at the same time like to have strong opinions. It's one thing to not be a deep thinker and not have opinions. It's another to have strong opinions and not be a deep thinker. But these opinions can shape our future, right? Because these people can end up in positions of power. They can end up in churches also, by the way. They can end up in mosques. They can end up as an atheist. They can be in all different places. And the human factor will come into play, regardless of how good the original thought was. Once the human factor comes in, we don't know where we're going to go. But that's how I view religions, where I think that's the natural evolution, considering that the religion is for humans, that they're going to walk away from God eventually. For good reason, bad reason, that's debatable, but I think that's what's going to happen. What do you say about that?
Are we still on?
Yeah, we're on.
Okay.
Just one camera.
Well, I think the progression of humankind over the last, let's say, almost 4,000 years, has been towards some kind of theistic thinking. In the numbers we're looking at, if we include Christians, Muslims, and Hindus as theists, which they are, about half of humankind, or we're talking roughly, they have come to some kind of belief in a theistic approach towards their understanding of reality. There are certainly overlapping areas between Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and Hinduism. They have major differences, which we can get into. But then you have Buddhists, technically speaking, that's not a religion, it's a way of life, because they have no supernatural dimension to their system.
Right.
But then when we get to a huge swath of the East, China has no theistic grounding to it. Confucianism, which is certainly a major part of Chinese society, is a natural way of life. It's very similar to Buddhism, in a sense that life is to be lived on the daily level without any supernatural element. Just let me... So we could say, roughly, maybe half the world is theistic, half the world is not. But in terms of moving away from theism, I see it just the opposite. And I base that on my study of human consciousness, which goes all the way back to thousands of years before biblical times. The drive, and again I said this earlier, the human drive towards truth is a need. That is a need of the human intellect. The human intellect craves to know. And to know what? To know what is true in any given experience, in any situation. The drive towards truth, and as I mentioned before, ultimately ends, if you follow it through all the ins and outs and levels and dimensions of human thought and consciousness, the drive for truth ends up in the drive for the supernatural, for God. And I don't like to use the word supernatural because that's impersonal. Because in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, it's towards a personal relationship with the supernatural God. God is at least more personal than supernatural. So, based on the nature of the human mind, that drive cannot end up anywhere else. You know who said that most succinctly is St. Augustine. In his great work, The Confessions, right at the very beginning. His Confessions is the biography of his journey, his conversion journey, from a hedonist to a Christian, in the search for happiness. And what do we conceive happiness to be? Well, happiness is when you found something that so resonates in you that it must be true. Right? Now, what But Augustine said after his journey, many years, searching for happiness,
Please continue.
first as a hedonist, he really thought that he could find true happiness in pleasure, in bodily pleasure.
Huh.
He pursued that path for many years. However, in the end, it didn't work out. He did not become happy. He eventually, due to his mother, who was a Christian, said, well, I haven't found happiness anywhere else. My mother keeps wanting me to look into this. I have nothing to lose. So he got involved in the search for happiness in Christianity. And eventually he said, now I found happiness. And he summed it up, his life's journey, in one sentence. He said, our hearts are restless, O God, until they rest in thee. And that summed up his whole restless life, searching for happiness. Like that, there was an old country song back in the 80s called Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places. And that describes so much of the human journey, so much of the irreligious human journey that you described Mr. Gervais as doing. Right? Mm-hmm. But now, let me say one thing, though. We have to clearly differentiate between institutional religion and religious experience. And that's why I always base my courses on religious experience, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. And I always found it to resonate with students when we talked about their own personal experiences of truth, not in what somebody told them is true. Because, of course, that's going to turn anybody off when you come down on them with the truth. Right? But if you lead them to discover for themselves and through themselves what is true, now you're cooking.
Right.
Okay? You want to say something?
Yeah, so in your worldview, is there a place for people that are agnostic?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me just say, there's no such thing as an atheist. Intellectually, you can't be an atheist because, as you clearly mentioned, that was, again, insightful. An atheist, by definition, is saying, I know something which is not capable of knowing. Mm-hmm. Right?
Exactly.
How can anyone say, I know that this thing cannot exist? You'd have to know everything there is to know.
Exactly.
To know that.
To confidently say. And yeah, I mean, look, religion is such a topic. We can just keep going on and on and on. I have so many other questions I can ask, but I do want to touch up on few current social topics.
Absolutely.
And would love to get your quick take on them. And
Good.
One of the things that come to mind is we see that the political divide in the country currently is at its most extreme that we have seen. Based on my observation, this political divide started, if I had to pick a time, it started somewhere around the 90s. It went to its extreme limits when George W. Bush and Al Gore were locked in that whole situation with the election, with George W. Bush eventually winning. And then since then, media has played a role, absolutely. Things have just become a little bit too extreme over time. one side calls the other less smart for, trying to use a nice word there. But things have just gotten worse over time, and it's gotten to the point where we now have people that actually hate capitalism, completely ignoring the fact where we come from as a country. Then on the other hand, we have people that actually believe that evil has taken over, possibly in some cases, and they believe in conspiracy theories in some cases, which are too extreme. In your observation, first question is, when do you think this started? And who is the biggest player that has played the biggest role, intentionally or unintentionally, in fueling this divide?
Good question. I believe the divide started certainly at least back in the 1800s with the introduction to the world of a new anti-supernatural philosophical belief system. And I'm referring to Marxism. That spread and continues to spread throughout the world today. And that has infected a huge swath of American society. And this has been at work for a long time. This isn't just a product of the last 10 or 20 years. This started a long time ago, made its way from a European beginning into American society many years ago. And unpopular as it was, it did stay alive. And slowly but surely, it has made advances. What we see today is the flowering of this highly destructive, nihilistic train of thought, which has done so much damage to American culture. And we're in a fight for the life of this culture. And I don't know how many people really understand what's going on.
Not many.
These other people do. They know exactly what they want to do.
Who are these people?
Well, what is generally referred to today as the left. They want to restructure our educational system so that from the ground up, the next generations are taught their nihilistic philosophies. That's where it all begins. If they can gain control, and now they have quite a bit of control over the educational system.
They do.
They can brainwash little kids from the ground up that their philosophy is true, and it's not.
So the question is, what is in it for them?
They are religious.
So this is their ideology, essentially.
Exactly. They are as fervent as, and probably more fervent than any religious cult you can name. They are on a mission to secularize Western culture in the pursuit of their belief that their vision of how human beings should live is the true one.
So being secular is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm assuming you're referring to a particular way a particular kind of secularism, right? Because we are secular already.
Oh yes, but
We're tolerant.
but those are these terms have their overlaps, but they are extraordinarily anti-religious, and they're against religion. They're not tolerant of religion. They're against it.
Agreed.
Now that's very telling,
Mm-hmm.
right? Again, that gets back to the fact that they're complete subjectivists, and that gets back to their philosophical errors.
I don't know if they're subjective. I think in their opinion, what they're doing is important, and they have some kind of objectivity to it. Having said that, the people they appeal to are very subjective people, and the way the message is sold is based on, just think from your heart in the spur of the moment. It feels right, doesn't it? Must be right. So what do you have to say about the people that are easily buying into those messages? Because they aren't just buying into the messages. It really appeals to them. They're passionate about it. We're seeing cancellations of speakers in colleges and universities just because, this person's going to spew hate. Okay, then don't go, right? Tolerance levels are coming down. So in some ways, that's, if there was an overlap in the way you describe secularism and the way I did, we're going backwards. Our tolerances, we can't get offended now.
I would agree with you.
But why? What's happening with these people that are buying into that? Because I'm sure that there were people that were able to push this message out that, no, I want to be tolerant of disagreements. But now that's going away. What happened? Why have people just given up on tolerance?
Because they have this fervent belief that their view of the way society should function is true, is right.
And is the only view that should be held.
Right, you're right. And to any intellectual analysis that's so full of error, it doesn't hold any water. But the strong pull in human nature to selfishness, to place the self over everything else, that's very strong. The antidote to that are the great religious traditions, which teach sacrifice, which teach as much respect for the other as for the self. They don't have any of that. In fact, just the opposite.
But see, for a young person, the argument would be, look, because of religions, we've had so many wars, so many people have died. So it's easy to tell a young person that that's not where the answer is. We need everybody to be equal. And equal means everybody should have equal opportunity and equal outcome of that opportunity. And then they mix in feminism in it. They mix in racism in it. They bring in events that took place hundreds of years ago to prove the point today. For example, slavery. And on paper, it sounds like a very appealing, attractive product for a young person, a young, passionate person to buy, who again is not going to do too much work in terms of research and understanding this, but it's an attractive product to buy. So can we blame them?
Oh, I think we can, because it contradicts the workings of human consciousness. You're responsible for the choices you make, which are the product of your own thinking. So yes, you make an important point, and this is important to point out. For example, in the Catholic Church, as I said before, but I want to add this addition, this footnote, you have freedom of conscience, ultimately. The Catholic Church says that. You can line up all their big books and their catechisms and say, well, that's what they tell you you should be like and do. But in the end, they say, but it's your job to form your personal conscience about what you think is right. And then you must follow it once you determine what you think is right. But here's the big but. Before you have the privilege of reaching that position of choice, you have an obligation to examine all of the relevant evidence in pursuit of the truth. That's the key.
But that is not by law. It is up to the individual.
Absolutely.
And in my limited observation of human beings are not very smart creatures. Majority. So these are generalizations, right? I'm not talking about exceptions, of course, because if it weren't for the exceptions, we wouldn't have electricity here right now. So generally speaking, I do not find human beings to be very smart. So we're in trouble, is what I'm saying.
Therefore, all the more importance placed on our educational system.
Professors.
And
teachers.
And in starting with the grammar schools.
Absolutely.
That's where we lose them. I can tell you this from my experience. The students that I've had over 25 years in teaching college, the students who had the worst problems and who didn't make it, their problems were all grounded in their early years. Mm. They came to college completely unprepared mentally, intellectually, to deal with it. Not to mention the other things that are necessary, like the work ethic of a college student. Attending, being prepared, being on time, etc. I have 7 of them in my development of, I don't know if you remember, I used to have a personal conduct grade, which were all abstract qualities of the good student. Because in learning how to think, it's not so much the content that you are taught, it's the way you go about it. That's the key that's what you should really take away from college. How to learn anything, right? Apply yourself. Be there, attend. Be prepared. Put in the work, just like the athletes we were talking about.
Absolutely.
Put in the work.
There is no shortcut to success. Whether that's success as a professional athlete or whether that success means that you want to become just a good citizen.
You're absolutely right.
Agreed. But we are in trouble, is what I am basically saying. And professors, for the most part, do not think and view the world the way you do.
Agreed.
And I understand you're a religious person, Christian theologian, so you bring that aspect into your teachings.
Well, I tried. I really tried very hard not to.
Well, in science and religion, naturally it had to, right? Because you had to use examples. But in other classes, you didn't.
Because many students would say to me, well, what do you believe? What do you believe? And I would refrain from telling them because I wanted them to make up their minds and not be colored by saying, oh, well, if Professor Christie thinks this, then maybe I should think that. And maybe I should have said that. I don't know. But I tried not to predispose my students.
Okay. So let me give you my overall view of religions, the way I look at things, and how it affects the world, and it sort of ties everything together in my observation and my experience. And then please critique it and tell me what you think of it. I know you're going to disagree with it, but I still would like to hear if there's any weakness there.
Let's go for it.
So I'm not a religious person, right? I was more religious before I took your class. than I am now. What your class did was it made me think and question everything. For the first time in my life, I was allowed to unlearn. And what I mean by that is I was allowed to question things. I still remember in one of the classes I asked you that, hey, professor, do you think that it's possible that there is no heaven or hell, and these are just motivating factors that God placed in our minds so we would be good human beings and good to others in this world? You said no, which I understood. Why? But that's where I started to think that what if religions are not what we think? And I just kept thinking, and over time, when I lost my mom and my dad recently, it was a pretty dark time in my life, and I know you lost your son recently, so you can relate to it probably a lot more than most other people. So that day, when I lost my mom, I had to go to the hospital, and I had to be the one that had to tell them that, okay, we're going to end the life support. No one else was allowed. It was COVID. I couldn't even go inside the room, so it was a very difficult experience. So I made the decision, and once it was over, funeral was done, I started to think there were so many things that my mom wanted me to focus on in my life, to build, to get better, to do well. But if this is what happens, then what's the point? I always thought that there's nothing after life, right? Once you pass away, you pass away. That's it. And I still think that. But because of that thinking, I realized that I can maybe live with the fact that my parents' life is actually over and there's nothing after that. But knowing the people that I have known in my life, the people that I have observed, if this is the truth and they knew this truth, they're not going to be able to go through this pain that I am able to. And they're going to get depressed. They're going to stop doing everything. They're going to say, if that's where I'm going to end up, why am I working hard? Why should I get up from bed every day? And that's when I started to realize the importance of religions. That it doesn't matter if they're true or they're not true. That's not the question. The question is that in times when there's nothing that gives you hope, your belief system comes for your rescue. Not everyone can afford a good therapist, and not all therapists are good. But your religion can be the biggest therapist, where it tells you, your parents are now in a better place, don't worry about them. But in order for them to be happier, continue their legacy. And something extremely positive comes out of the religious experience or religious belief. And that's when I realized that, wow, I never realized, regardless of my personal opinion on whether something is true or not, doesn't always necessarily mean that it's not useful or it doesn't have extreme importance in human mind. And human mind is a very complex thing, as we have discussed in our class too. Something so physical gives birth to something so non-physical. And that thing that is non-physical, our consciousness, we don't always get to dictate how it's going to think. But having a strong belief system grounds you and it gives you hope. So that's my view on religions now, right now. It's always evolving. That they're extremely important for sanity of human society. The suicide rates would go up if religions were to disappear. If we think there's more depression now, it's going to be even worse if there were no religions. So it's a great tool to have. We can argue, we can debate on its accuracy and whatnot till, for another few generations. But that's how I view religions, that they're extremely important. And so is science. Science serves a completely different purpose. What are your thoughts on this? Did I offend you?
I always have opinions. Let me start it in the negative. The crisis we find our culture in today is because of that very godlessness that we find in the Marxist anti-religious doctrine that is spreading rapidly. It denies anything that you just ended saying at your end. It says that is all. Marx's favorite phrase for it was the opiate of the people. It simply meant to drug you out. And that's why he hated religion. He said that's what keeps men in shackles. They need to throw off their shackles and overthrow the forces of oppression. And that is exactly what we're experiencing. These people view...
Would you find commonality in that and what I said?
I'm saying they want to overthrow your kind of thinking at the end, where you talked about the positivity of religious thinking.
Agreed.
They would say, wake up. That's just, you're just smoking a joint. There is none of that. Look at cold, hard reality. You're being oppressed by forces around you, and we must vanquish them. And that's why they're anti-capitalist, because they see anything like that as oppressive, right? How dare you better yourself than anyone else? Again, so anti-historical, because anyone who has followed the history of communism in the last 150 years or so sees that it's been a horrendous failure. I was reading an article just last night by a woman who lived under the Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution back in the 1960s in China, and she had to escape from China because her writings were considered anti-state, and she was in danger of being arrested and possibly erased. But her memoirs of the Cultural Revolution, and this is recently, this is in the 60s in China, this isn't far gone. She said starvation was massive under the Chinese communist methods for society, the way they pushed this leveling of society, destroyed
the equality.
Yeah, or equity. That's the big negative term. It means it means the opposite of equality.
No, I just meant that it's in the disguise of the term equality.
Right. And it was just a refresher course when I read it for the evils that we saw under Russian communism that met the same fate. It completely crashed, and we're headed in that direction. If these forces in American culture can achieve what they want, that's what we're going to see. That's what's in the future, and anyone who doesn't see that is simply blind. And they may only see it when it's too late.
Are you aware of Jordan Peterson?
Where do I know the name from? I've heard the name.
He is someone that became very famous on YouTube about, I think, at this point, 2 years ago. And so he is a professor, a psychiatrist in Canada, University of Toronto he worked for. And there came a point where they wanted to legislate in Canada that any person that is that wants to change their pronouns to whatever they want, by law, you should be required to address them using those pronouns, not by choice. And he, as a professor, he said that I'm not going to do this. I am not for compelled speech. So there was a lot of backlash. People did not like him in the university. His fellow professors said a lot of bad things about him. And some of his lectures started to get coverage on YouTube. People started to post about him. His message started to resonate with a lot of young people. And he became a bigger name, and then he was invited to a show in England. And I can't remember the lady's name that interviewed him. And she asked him a question, and she said, why should your right to freedom of speech outweigh the right of a trans human being not to be offended? And he, in reply, said, it's exactly the same to what you're doing right now. You are willing to offend me because you are looking for the truth. He said, in order for you to be able to think, you have to risk offending people. Without that right, we cannot think clearly anymore. That one line made him very, very, very famous. Since then, he's been on the biggest shows in the world. Bill Maher, he's met up with Piers Morgan. One of the big names in the world of soccer, Cristiano Ronaldo, invited him to come over because he was going through a very lean patch. And that helped him. Meeting him, talking to him helped him. So he's a smart man. And he talks about all of this stuff that we're talking about. And his worldview is very similar to what you are sharing. So the reason I brought him up is there are people that are speaking up and they're resonating with millions. So if you look this guy up on YouTube, you will see that every single video he posts, he gets over millions of views. It's resonating with people. Something's
Great.
changing.
Thank you for that tip. You see, you've taught me something today.
So what's happened is, because of him, others have now spoken up. So there's a bit of a trend going on. I don't know if it's enough, but I didn't see this earlier. And it's a very common sense message. So he talks about feminism also. I'm not sure what your view on feminism is, but his view on feminism is that it's great. We need to have equality. We need to give people equal opportunity, but we cannot guarantee equal outcome. Because equal outcome should depend on the choice and the work they put into the opportunity given to them. Things like that. He gives great examples. He says when there's chaos, people go back to their primal roles, not the ones that we believe people should have. For example, if there's war, or if someone comes and knocks on the door at night, the wife is going to expect the guy to go. And if there is someone that needs kindness and sensitivity, it's the wife that's going to go and take care of that person and not the man. Those things still hold true in his opinion. So it's interesting to look at his worldview and how he looks at this. And he also mentions a lot of Marxism, that's where a lot of this is coming from. So I think it would be very interesting to get your take on him if you ever meet again next time, maybe.
Yes, I will make it a note to do so.
Yes.
I'll say something about feminism. First of
Please
all,
do.
on the one hand, I am a very, very big feminist on the one hand, and that is for this reason. When I was growing up, my parents separated when I was about 12. And I remember that my mother had to go out to work to support us. And I never forgot how, as a woman, back in the late 50s and early 60s, she got the short end of the stick. Financially, which then had its effect on us, the children. And I've never forgotten those lessons. So no one would ever be allowed to do that to any female that I had anything to do with. So that's my pro-feminist pitch. Now, on the other hand, in many respects, it has gone too far. I think, once again, extremists took over the feminist movement and pushed it in ways that were destructive to females. I think it has a lot to do with the breakdown of the American family since the 60s. Right now, 1 out of every 2 marriages in American culture ends in divorce. You know that?
And 70% of them were initiated by women.
Is that right? That I didn't know. Mm-hmm. Fabulous statistic. Mm-hmm. Great. That leads to, which I would definitely want to say something about, since this just happened last week in Congress. It has led to the horrendous evil of abortion, which was legalized in 1973 with the Roe v. Wade decision, which was legally and intellectually and factually a very flawed decision, if you ever read it, which I'm glad was overturned recently. But we now kill close to 1.3, 1.5 million babies a year. Mm. And then I've heard leftist politicians cry about the decline of the population in America. Well, yes, you're killing them. Mm. But now, most recently, this shows you the horrendous direction we're going in. Just this past week, a bill was introduced in Congress to say that any baby born alive as the result of a botched abortion must be given medical care. Doesn't sound like anyone with any human being would vote against that. Do you know that this was in the House of Representatives? 210 out of 212 Democrats voted against it. They voted against any medical care for a live baby.
Was there anything else in the bill that was being basically snuck in, which they were really against and not this? Is that possible, or was the bill only?
Oh yes, I think if I remember correctly, which I have to put that in there, I believe that in there were going to be liabilities for any medical personnel who violated that, which I think is not unreasonable.
It's not unreasonable. But sometimes what happens is, and both the Democrats and Republicans are guilty of this, that when they put together a bill, which on paper sounds like something that no one should disagree with, but along with that, they have other things in there which are completely unacceptable to the other party. So when they vote against it, they look like the terrible people. Because to me, it doesn't seem like something that anyone would disagree with.
Well, let me ask you this. Mm-hmm. Do you think if those liabilities were taken out of the bill, do you think they would have voted for it? I doubt it.
I mean, if it's just the liabilities and that part that's in the bill and there's nothing else that we haven't talked about, then I agree with you. It's terrible for them to not vote. Having said that, so since we're talking about abortion, I just want to give my take on it too. I do think that women should be able to abort if they must, right? But it cannot be a casual decision. It cannot be just their decision. But it sort of works into a lot of the social aspects of it too. For example, I'll bring another aspect of this to light. Currently in our system, a woman can go and get abortion, or a woman can have a baby if she wants, even if the father doesn't want to have the baby, right? And then the father says that, look, I cannot afford to have this baby right now in my life. This was a mistake, right? It shouldn't have happened. And I'm trying to keep the pro-abortion or the pro-life aspect of it out of it for now, because this is a very practical outcome of this that a lot of people that I've known over time are still suffering from. So then they have the child, and the guy now has to pay child support, even though he was in no position to have the baby at that age. For example, he was 21, right? He still had to build his life, finish college. Or he had a job, but now all his money is going to go to the child. In some cases, it's a very unreasonable amount. So that child now is, and we know that that money is not going to go 100% to the child. Because in some cases, I have known people that have moved or come to this country to do this. So then their child would be a citizen and they would get free money from the guy. It's more common than we realize. I have a friend who literally every month he has about $200 or $300 left for himself after he's done with child support and alimony. For a wife that came from another country, he helped her settle down till he found out that she was cheating on him with his kid's doctor, by the way. And now he's destroyed for life. So abortion, not having the ability to abort, affects a lot of things other than just that life. And it's a very complex topic, is basically what I'm trying to say. And I don't know what the right answers are. If we simply take all abortions away, then yes, we'll save a lot of potential lives, no doubt about that. But we will also destroy a lot of lives. I don't know what the right way is. I honestly don't have a clear opinion on it yet.
Well, I have some opinions, which won't surprise you.
What do you think about, like, once you bring that aspect into it?
One thing that is never spoken about, never, maybe a tiny bit by the pro-life group, but it is this. Then don't have sexual relations. Don't engage in behavior which you know could end up creating a life. You cannot separate the behavior of those persons.
Do you talk about unprotected sex?
From,
correct?
Well, even...
Or even engaging in the act.
Well, even in protected sex, the experts tell us that it is only, it is not 100% effective.
It's 99%. Yeah, so there's 1% chance that you could.
Right. But now let's focus on this. The only reason people wind up in that situation is because of their own behavior. And they're accountable for that. A life that has been created should not pay that price.
Agreed.
Right? That baby should be allowed to live.
See, that baby won't pay the price for it, and the baby shouldn't, but the society will, right? And that is also a problem.
Oh, I'm sorry. What did you mean the society will?
So now you have unhappy people. That's one thing.
Made by their own behavior.
100%, right. Yes. But they don't have enough money to survive, which is a real problem. So you don't think that aspect needs attention?
Well, let me say this, because this is where my liberal side comes out. One thing we do not do, which I would totally be behind, is we do not provide nearly enough assistance in many ways for single parents.
Really?
And particularly what I'm talking about are young women and even girls who find themselves in this kind of a situation, and they're absolutely distraught. I know what I just said about being responsible for your behavior, but the fact is they find themselves in that situation, and we can't just point a finger at them and say, too bad for you, suffer. We need to be charitable. We need to help them.
But what are we not doing? I mean, I thought we're doing quite a bit.
Well, if we are, then that would seem to alleviate the financial problem. From everything we hear.
Well, for the single mothers, yes.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
not for the man.
Then we need to get into that.
Exactly.
I know from people I know how men have been abused by the system in ways that you're talking about. I'm very aware of that. Those are things which we need to correct in this system. We need to do better, a lot better, by women who find themselves in these unfortunate circumstances. And we also need to be more fair to fathers. Absolutely. I'm with you on that 100%. There's no reason why a father should be destitute because he has to pay child support. What right is there?
But don't you think that would then lead to more abortions? Because now if the mother knows that she is, I mean, I know it all goes back to personal responsibility, but for the cases that have already taken place, in that case, someone is pregnant. The guy is saying, I don't want the baby, I can't afford the baby, keep me out of it. And by law, they're not now required to pay child support. The girl's on her own now. The answer left, I mean, she's nothing, right? She's 19, 20, she has no money. The choice is either she has the baby and lives a miserable life, or lives with her parents at the time if she has the parents, or she aborts the child.
Well, I missed something there. Are you saying the current situation,
no, I'm
or
saying
under
if we
what
were
I propose?
Under what you're proposing, in that situation, wouldn't that lead to even more abortions then?
I'm missing something. How would that lead to more if the young girl knew she would get help?
Oh, no. I was talking about if the young girl knew that the guy can walk away and won't pay child support.
Oh, I wasn't proposing that.
Okay.
I mean, he should contribute what he is capable of, but something should be done. His life should not be almost destroyed.
I see what you're saying.
In order to do that. So something needs to be done, whether it's some kind of partial government assistance to help him or some such social construct. So that's where my liberalism comes out.
And where do you think that money is going to come from?
Well, it'll come from society, obviously. It
So
has
higher
to
taxes.
come from taxes. Has to come from taxes. But that raises a question of what are our values? Are our values to say, well, to save tax money, let's choose the death of the infant? I think I've always thought this, that abortion is the great American sin. And I'll say this because I've had a lot of discussion about this topic lately. 50 or 100 years from now, people are going to compare abortion to what slavery was back in the 1800s. And they're going to say, can you actually believe that this is what those people did?
Are you confident about that?
I am. Because of the evolution of human consciousness.
Right.
I believe people are going to say they actually killed babies because it was most of the time inconvenient. And I think they're going, just like we say now, can you believe that 150 years ago, our culture actually believed it was okay to own another human being? You see? Our culture evolved, and now we look back on that and say, how could they ever think that?
See, I can understand why slavery was happening. I can understand that if I were to put myself back in that time and see how things were going, because it had direct impact on economy, right? And more often than not, I've noticed that societal behavior is dictated by economic gains. Whether it's bad or over time the society looks back and realizes how morally corrupt they were at the time is different. So I can understand that having free labor in an economy that was trying to grow was attractive because it was also acceptable around the world at the time. They're like, hey, let's just get more than the world does, right? And we'll grow more than other countries. And we did. Now we look back and we realize, because now globally we find that to be an unacceptable thing, we look back at that as a very, very bad thing. When it comes to abortion, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different because only one of the two sexes has to go through it. I think that's the first complication we have there. And that gender also happens to be the one that we both know over time, or at least in the past, was a little bit more repressed than the other. So that adds another complexity to the debate. And then whatever we suggest, because it's going to single out the gender, right now it's a very difficult time to have that conversation because they already feel that they were oppressed for such a long time, that there's an overcorrection already happening when we have not even gotten to this proper debate, right, about abortion. And there's overcorrection already. So what do we do? I think it's possible that maybe in the future, once we have debated our hearts out over every single topic, and that's the only topic left, where all parties are then happy that in each of their individual topics they now have what they wanted, then maybe people would be willing to say, okay, this is something where women can look at this a little bit differently now. But I don't think we're there yet. It's probably going to take longer than 50 years, I would think, because right now we're still arguing Roe v. Wade.
That's true, and the Supreme Court recently, I think, had the proper perspective to come out and say, essentially what they said is Roe v. Wade, as many people have argued from the very beginning, was flawed because all they did do in the end, and I have studied this issue, all they did in the end was pick a principle to hang their hats on because they saw no other way out. I'm talking about the justices. They chose this principle of what is called viability. That means the point at which a baby is considered to be able to live outside the womb. Why is that the principle? They gave no reason for that. They just said because society was really in chaos back in 73 about this issue. They felt under the gun to come up with the resolution. So they said, well, here is what some doctors testified, that a baby cannot survive out of the womb before 6 months. So they said, let's pick that.
The partial, yeah.
Right, and say that abortions after 6 months are impermissible, which was not observed anyway because I don't want to go off too much on a tangent, but ever since then, we found, we meaning our society, found ways to completely skirt even that 6-month rule up until the 9th month of pregnancy by a technique, I think you may remember it, called partial birth abortion.
Mm-hmm.
Which
we actually debated that in 2004 and 2005 in college. Yeah,
which is the most heinous thing you can imagine. Even though the Supreme Court had said after 6 months that baby should be inviolable, that baby should live, and we found ways to say, okay, well, medically, we can find a technique
vacuum here
that will get around it.
Yeah, I mean, this topic, I understand the Supreme Court has had a ruling on it, which to people that are pro-life sounds like, okay, we're back on track. To people that are pro-abortion, it seems like, oh my God, we're back in the Stone Ages and whatnot. I still don't find that to be progress.
I agree with you.
Because it would be progress if the Supreme Court had equal number of liberal justices and equal number of Republicans. Then I would say, okay, this is societal progress that two parties debated, and that's the result. So right now, basically, Trump had the chance to put on a lot of conservative justices. They made the decision based on their view of life, and that's perfectly fine. They're entitled to it, totally legal. But as I said, that's not progress of the society. It's not progress at all, actually. It's just their opinion. Versus if they were liberal, then the opinion would have been the other way. Progress is when the society debates for years and years and years and says, okay, we're done. This is what we want. And then if you talk to a liberal person, on average, and an average conservative, if you ask them, they give relatively the same answers on the topic. That would be progress. But we're not there yet still. Do you agree?
170 years ago, that's what caused the Civil War. Because of the difference of opinion on the nature of a human being and property rights. I do think we are already in another civil war.
Agreed.
It's already
cold.
happened.
It's just cold.
Right, and it has already shown signs of volcanic eruption. But there was a point I wanted to make.
Sorry.
But it flew out of my head. Mm-hmm. But anyway.
Just so you know, this part of the podcast is audio only, because the battery of all cameras died.
Whatever
this
you
is
like.
No, this is great. So, while you're on the topic, and while you're trying to remember what that point was, as I said, we haven't really made progress on these, and I don't know where these topics are headed, but one of the distinct things that I noticed about America since I've moved here, now I've lived here longer than anywhere else in my life, is our ability to have two different opinions as a nation. As much as it seems like, oh my God, look at Americans, they elected Trump, then they elected Biden, then they had Obama, and then they make fun of us from outside. I don't really care about what outsiders think of us, because we are here and a complete anomaly when it comes to being people so we don't follow other countries. We do not get inspired by anybody. We are the people that do things before anybody else, and others follow us. So in some ways, we're unlucky, right? Because we don't really have any examples to follow. We create new precedents, and then those are used around the world in government systems, in media, whatever we have seen in the last 4 years happening in the media here. Now other countries are following it. So we are going to make wrong decisions. We're going to disagree. We're going to debate passionately. And sometimes we will come close to a war. And in my opinion, that is okay. That is who we are. That civil war, we're the only country that survived a civil war like that. Any other country would have been 50 different countries right now, or at least more than one. But we did for a reason, because we are the original when it comes to thought. And I like that. Whether it's some person saying that I want a semi-automatic gun to someone that's saying we should have no guns, I respect them both. Because what they do is they bring passion to a debate which is important given the society, which means we have a living, thriving society that thinks and cares and brings their opinion to the table. Where we end up, I don't think that matters in the long run, because we will end up somewhere, left or right. But the beauty of the journey and beauty of being an American is to be able to hear both sides. But if we shut that out, if we stop listening, then in some ways we're denying ourselves of Americanism. The experience is to be able to hear what the other person has to say and why. That is what makes us different. Not the fact that you have 50 states thinking exactly the same way, teaching exactly the same thing. What's the fun in that? Where's the growth in that? There's a reason why economically we have been superior. We've been innovative. Sure, it's possible that China is going to surpass us GDP-wise. But we all know how that GDP has come about. There's no originality there. There is nothing that inspires us that they have done. They have built a better city than New York City, but New York City was the first. That's where we're different. As long as we don't forget that, that's what worries me the most about our society. As long as we don't forget that we can be the first in almost everything in the world and not get stuck on these debates. These debates are healthy, but they should continue simultaneously as we continue to progress. But if you have an entire side, and I worry about the extreme left, and I call it extreme left because there are people on the left that are very reasonable.
I agree.
Right? That sometimes they would fiscally be conservative, but they are liberal overall. The extreme left is, I don't think they understand the commonalities between what they're believing and communism. Because they deny it when you ask them. They don't say, what's wrong with communism? They just deny it, even though if they continue on the path, the natural destination will be communism. So that's the only thing that worries me. It's okay for them to think communism is okay. I'm okay with that too, as long as they do not stop the people that don't agree with them.
Very wise, grasshopper.
So. Am I missing anything in forming this opinion, or what do you think? Because I want to make sure that I get your take on this.
I agree very much with what you had to say. Do you remember my allusion to grasshopper? No?
I do remember the line. I just don't remember where it's from.
It refers back to the television series Kung Fu that was on, not the rerun, but the original. And the grasshopper was what the blind old monk used to call his pupil when they would go through lessons. So it's just a phrase that I think is cute.
Yep. Yeah, I remember now. So grasshopper basically is just student. Yes. in this context.
But I agree with what you had to say. It's very multi-leveled, very balanced, very insightful. I think you very accurately have your thumb on the crux of the matter, and I think the problem we're faced with, which I'll just try to wrap it up in one term, is what might be called something like an American nationalism, which would just make steam come out of the ears of some ultra-leftists who are against both of those phrases.
Right, you mean the globalists, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. We should virtually dissolve into a kind of a new society with no borders, no commonalities at all. And if you could even imagine that, it would be a travesty beyond words, because there is no such society in this world. Every society has its nationalism, its borders, its cultural traits, like a language, traditionally a religion or religions. They all have them. And these people are fighting against America having those things. That's what makes it so dangerous today.
Exactly.
But
And
it's to your generation to solve now.
I mean, there are two other generations after mine. I mean, technically I'm millennial, but it was so close to the generation before that I can't really relate to all of them in terms of thinking. So millennials tend to blame boomers for a lot of things, right? Hence the phrase, okay, boomer. I don't know if you've heard of that, but that is a phrase. So whenever someone from the baby boomer generation gets into a debate with someone that's a millennial, and the millennials don't agree, they use a phrase called okay, boomer. I find that extremely offensive. That's their way of saying that, okay, you're out of touch. It's our time. And I grew up in a culture where you respect elders and you always seek guidance and wisdom from them. And you don't try to act like you know everything. That actually is true in general, even if there's no age divide, even if there's a profession divide. You respect people that have seen more because there's always something to be learned. So I can't quite respect that approach. So I find myself disagreeing with a lot of young people. But then I talk to them and I always realize that they just don't think enough, or they just don't know enough about the topic, because eventually they end up agreeing with me once we basically go deeper. But on surface level, they would continue to disagree with me, which is incredible how their minds work sometimes. But yeah, that's a topic in its own. I would take hours. So what I try to do on this podcast is I also try to talk to Generation Z people, which are teenagers, 20, 21-year-olds, to get their take on things. And I also try to talk to millennials, and I let them speak, even if I disagree with something, because it just helps in me understanding how other people, from their vantage point, how does the world look? Because maybe I'm wrong.
Well, we've come full circle back to these people as violators of the very tenets of sound epistemology, what we know and how we know it. That means you are responsible for processing your own thinking in a logical and consistent and thorough way. And you're right, so many people do not, they can't be bothered
Exactly.
with that kind of rigorous thinking.
Exactly. So before we end this, two questions for you. In the next 12 months, let's make it 24 months. What is the biggest thing that you think is going to happen, if you had to predict it, in American politics? That's one thing. And second would be, who do you think, and answer might be the same, who do you think is going to be our next president?
Well, in American politics, I can only hope and pray that the Democrats will be put out of office, because in just 2 years, they have done so much destruction to American society. Now, who would our next president be?
But please remember, this is more of a prediction, not a hope. So where do you see things going? You're hoping Democrats won't be in power, but are you predicting they won't be in power?
Okay. I think it's going to be a toss-up for who takes the White House. because the population is very divided. Yes, I've expressed my hope that we will move back towards the center from the left, because I think it's self-evident how much damage they've done. But something that really surprised me and saddened me was the midterms. The Democrats did much, much better than one would have thought. You know what that said to me? It said that, yes, according to all the polls, people want change, but they don't want the Republicans to make it. They want the Democrats to change their ways. They want a more centrist Democratic president. That's what they want.
Which, honestly, I thought Biden was, but the people around him, I guess, sort of swayed him to be more left than he would have been.
Well, very interestingly, I saw a tape of what he said before the elections. And, see, I don't subscribe to the fact that the man is senile. He may have some motor skill issues because of age, but that's different from intellectual issues.
Right.
I heard him say, in his own words, that he was going to be the most progressive president in history. He put it out there.
Right, but I think that was to get votes. That's what I think.
But he became the most progressive president since FDR.
Agreed, but some of the things that have happened, and this can get very detailed, but I'll quickly make one last point before we end this. So he was told that his vice presidential nominee should be a woman, and that too of color. He was told that. This is not something that he was going to do if it were up to him. And when he made that decision, that told me that he is being told in terms of what he needs to do to appeal to the extreme left, because how big of a voter base that is. Because when Hillary Clinton didn't appeal to them, they lost even to Trump. Because at that time, in anyone's books, it was almost impossible for Trump to win, but he did. And if it had not been for Bernie Sanders talking the way he talked about Hillary Clinton, his voters would have made sure that Hillary Clinton was president. So I think since then that was a learning experience, that he probably brought in people that, okay, I don't want to make the mistakes that Hillary Clinton made, so tell me what do I need to do. So I think some of that comes from there. And because they voted, he has to give back. So for example, student loan forgiveness and all that stuff. I don't agree with it, but those are extreme left things to do. But he didn't even suggest that when he was vice president, which tells me something. So I think there's a bit of a tug of war going on in the Democratic Party. And I don't know who's going to win, because Biden is too old to continue. And even in his own term, he couldn't do it, right? He is the most progressive in terms of the laws he signed.
Well, I think if he ran, that he would still do well, because where else is the left going to go? There is nowhere else for them to go if he secures the nomination.
What are your thoughts on Kamala Harris?
My thoughts are empty, because I think she is.
Empty? That's right.
No, I feel sad for her, because she was in way over her head. She was totally unequipped for that position.
Yes. I think that's the most appropriate way of summing up. That's how I look at her too. She wasn't ready for it. There's a reason why she lost the way she lost in the primaries. And then this was given to her because of the way she looks and the gender she happens to be, which, by definition is sexist and racist, but we can get into that some other time.
That could really hurt the Democrats' chances if they ever went in her direction. Probably the guy who's making the biggest noise is the California governor, Gavin Newsom, but he's so leftist. The Biden played a hide and seek game with the electorate 2 years ago. He didn't come out he came out as a moderate, not as a radical, and he fooled a lot of people.
100% agreed.
And Gavin Newsom is an out-and-out leftist from the very beginning. So I think he would turn off a lot of middle-of-the-road voters. That's where the battle always is.
Oh yeah, what is it called? The Rust Belt. What is it called? Minnesota and
Up north, yeah.
Yes. So those states, Michigan, there are a couple of others that Hillary Clinton lost to Trump, but Biden was able to get them back. It's always about that. It's always about those states and Florida. So even if Democrats lose Florida, they always want to make sure that they win those 4 states. If they win Florida, then it's a big victory like it was for Obama. For Republicans, I think Ron DeSantis is someone that, you know who that is?
Oh,
the
yeah.
Florida governor?
Oh, yeah.
So Ron DeSantis, I think, is going, if he runs, and I don't know why they're not pushing him enough. And this is speaking from a very neutral point of view. I don't take sides in politics anymore. I am done with supporting parties. So this, to me, is just like analyzing a game of chess, right? I think if they properly push Ron DeSantis and get rid of Trump, that guy can win a lot of Democrats. Because he's reasonable and he's logical. Only if you listen to him. Not through the eyes of media, but his own interviews. He's a pretty reasonable guy. Yeah, he's very conservative in some things, and people may not agree with some of the things. But overall, I think he has a good message.
I think he would garner substantial support. If Donald Trump gets the nomination, I would definitely vote for him. I think the big unfortunate issue is his ability versus his personality. And maybe his ability comes from that personality, I don't know, but having lived through many, many presidents, well, a fair amount of presidents, I didn't know how he was going to be, and I saw policy after policy that really worked. On immigration, it helped a lot.
Mm-hmm.
On the economy, it helped a lot. On international relations, it helped a lot. He came up with, I was astounded that he came up with those Abrahamic peace accords in the Middle East. He quieted down North Korea. He quieted down China. I was amazed at what he got done.
Well, so, okay. So I got to ask you
He
something.
also destroyed ISIS, which
Correct.
we've even forgotten about now, which was just a fantastic thing.
Yeah.
But then he goes off and gets much too garrulous for his own good. And that's what people really dislike about him. I haven't heard anybody knock his policies. What they knock is his abrasiveness.
Most of his policies actually got continued by Biden too because they were good policies, especially the foreign policies. But the question I have for you is, as a conservative, and I don't know if you call yourself conservative or not.
I guess I would.
Okay.
But I don't agree that Biden continued his Trump's
some of the
policies.
policies.
I don't. Which ones?
So recently I was, I can't remember where I heard this, but some of his policies against China were untouched, except for the tariffs, which Biden, according to who I was listening to at the time, and that's another thing these days, right? I mean, I don't know how accurate that was, because I don't know exactly what the policy was, that they found that policy against China works. And, actually, this was on Joe Rogan. Do you know Joe Rogan?
Yeah.
So this was on Joe Rogan. Someone came and they were talking about China and the policies over time that we've had against China. And one of the things that came up was that he feels that China, even though they're getting more powerful, but they're also getting isolated in the world. And he said because of that, Biden continued most of the policies that Trump had in place because they were working. That's all I heard. So I'm assuming that they were accurate because it's, someone that's challenging Joe Rogan. If it was blatantly false, Joe Rogan would have disagreed. So some of them got continued. So I agree that fiscally, his policies were good. Foreign policy, I also agree with. As far as ISIS is concerned, I think that is more of an achievement of our Department of Defense. And it always has been, even with Osama bin Laden. I know the presidents get the credit, but there's so much work that they put in for years and decades into it. But yes, someone has to say yes to the final attack. I agree.
But incidentally, Biden was against the bin Laden raid. I don't know if you knew that.
I did not know that.
He voted against it. When they were in the war room and Obama went around the table, everyone...
So Obama overruled basically whatever he was suggesting.
Everyone else gave it a go, advised Obama to go for it, and Biden told him not to do it.
I'm assuming it was because it was on foreign soil.
Well, I don't know what went into his rationale, but I do agree it was a tough call.
Because it's on foreign soil and you're not telling them, and they have the ability to come and bring our jets down, fighter jets down. So it was a very difficult decision, I'm sure. Much more difficult than the ISIS raid because, it's a war zone.
Yeah. I give Obama, who I voted against 2 times, I give him a lot of credit for having the guts to do that.
Exactly. When someone makes a good decision, I think we should all say, okay, this was good, the rest was bad. And however we analyze things. So I think Ron DeSantis, if they're able to push him, if it's Donald Trump versus Biden, I think Biden's going to probably win again simply because of how people are looking at things.
It'll be a tough call for the centrists in the country. Do they want 4 more years of what Biden is doing? Or do they want to go back to pretty much what they know Trump will do and listening to his abrasiveness?
Right. So I think as a party, that's a silly move on the part of Republicans because it's what's going to happen. Why repeat it? Why put so much money and effort into it when you have a younger guy, Ron DeSantis, who's pretty much the same thing?
What would you think about a Trump-DeSantis ticket?
Ron DeSantis would never do that. He's a star of his own. He's not going to be second to anybody. That's what I think. That
really would give him phenomenal national exposure.
100% they're going to win.
Put him in the driver's seat.
100% he's going to win if he can pull that off. But I think Ron DeSantis has some disagreements with Trump, which indirectly I read about in the news, but I don't know what they're over. But there are some. The issue with Trump is that he wants to come across as the main character. He was able to do that to Mike Pence. Mike Pence, the nicest guy in the world, took it, never said a word, even till the last day, when he literally said it's in Mike Pence's hands, when they were about to finish the process of the elections. But Ron DeSantis is not a quiet guy.
This is true.
He's the main actor of his own show.
This is true.
So how do you get someone like that to be quiet? And Trump needs people around him to be quiet because that's how he outshines them. It's just, that's just how he is. Nothing wrong with it. That's just how, if you have a formula for success, you're going to stick to it. And Ron DeSantis, knowing that he could be president one day, he's going to be very careful what he does. So I just don't see that happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, a lot will happen over the next 24 months.
It's going to be very interesting.
Actually, November, December, 22 months. 22 months.
Yeah. But this has been a pleasure.
Oh, a great pleasure. I enjoyed it very, very much.
Mm-hmm. And I hope that we can do more of this as things change whenever we feel like, hey, there's something that we can talk about now, something that happens recently in the society maybe. We can sit down and talk.
That would be just great. Thank
Awesome.
you so much, Bilal.
Thank you for coming.
You are most welcome.
Thank you.